2-0 defeat for India against Sri Lanka. And as we get started with our rant, already in the comment section, there are a lot of people who are very excited. I think, Jared, that's hint enough.
What are they excited at? Just our smiling faces,
The
I would assume.
postmortem.
What's the opening question you want to ask me, Megha? So I can ruin it for you.
So last time around, we said the thumbnail as what is India's issues with spin. We didn't talk about it. We talked about all other possible topics under the sun. But let's start with that. 27 wickets to spin. And for the first time that it has happened, a 3-match ODI series.
It's a lot of wickets. It's really interesting. Do you remember during the Bazball series, there was a story, I think KP said this, that Rahul Dravid wanted the players to sweep more. And it was a really interesting one when he said it. And I've talked to Rahul Dravid about it since. He did say it, and he was thinking about it. And what he was saying really was he thought current Indian players were very good against spin, but they were very one-dimensional against spin. And you could argue, I'm sure if you coach the England team, he'd be like, you guys need to use your feet more against spin, right? And what he was looking for was situations where sometimes you can't use your feet anymore. You can't play spin traditionally, and so you need to sweep and reverse sweep and everything else. And it's really interesting that that's what Rohit Sharma has come out and said from this particular series. So I think we're in another situation there where that is part of it. Sri Lanka is a slightly different kind of spin conditions to India. It's similar, I think, in many ways, but probably the ball spins a little bit further. Well, actually, not even probably. It does spin a lot further. And these wickets were set up to spin. I think if Rinku Singh is bowling, I think we know just how bad these wickets are for the ball going any direction of straight at that point. So I think it's something very interesting to look forward to. The other issue is that, and this goes back to Test cricket again, India have played a lot of Test matches over the last few years on wickets that have completely sapped the confidence of their players against spin, right? And they did it, and they've won their Test matches, and they've lost a couple of games because of it. But overall, they've spared Jadeja and Ashwin massive workloads. They've won a whole bunch of Test matches, and they've been dominant at home. But it probably was the reason that Virat Kohli really struggled as much as he did when he had his form dip, is that he couldn't go home and score runs anymore, right? And he went from him and Pujara were averaging something like 80 against spin over a 2 or 3 year period before India started changing their wickets. And no one was averaging 80 against spin combined. 3 or 4 people weren't averaging 80 against spin afterwards. So things have changed in Indian cricket quite a bit. And if you then factor in the IPL wickets, outside of Chennai, and some other wickets occasionally, we don't get the rank turners that we used to get, those really cool, low and slow wickets. So I wonder if you're an international Indian player and you don't play a lot of Ranji Trophy, and even the Ranji pitches have been helping seamers over the last couple of years. But if you don't play a lot of that level of cricket, I wonder if you have the same level of skill overall as you once had when playing spin. And that's probably the sort of stuff that Rahul Dravid is looking at, right? Or Rahul Dravid and now Rohit Sharma we're looking at, which is we're probably just not as all-round quality against spin as we once were. And, you go through the history of cricket, India have always been the best players of spin. They're probably still the best players of spin right now, even after this series. But this was a particular series where it didn't go their way.
The contrast is very apparent because in Sri Lanka's case, their top order batters in particular using all sorts of sweeps to their advantage, not as many down the ground shots as compared to India, where Indian batters, even when they tried to go for sweeps, they didn't execute it as well. Now, this takes me back to say early 2010, where the back-to-back whitewashes in England and then in Australia that prompted a change in the Indian domestic setup, where calls were made for pitches to be more sporty, quote unquote sporty. They wanted it to be similar to, if not exactly identical to, what is to be found in Australia, South Africa, England for that matter. So there as well, there has been a paradigm shift. So how do you get players who are really good at playing spin? And places like Sri Lanka, the ball is bound to move more, spin more than it does at other places. Bangladesh is also very similar.
I think something's happened in cricket as well. And I think that's what the Rohit Sharma Rahul Dravid conversation ultimately leads to, which is Indians have always been the best players against spin, largely on the back of using your feet to spin. And um, if you look at Pakistan and Sri Lanka, two very good examples of teams that Pakistan have been pretty good players of spin, maybe not on India's level, but pretty good players of spin. And Sri Lanka have been, probably just behind India on levels of spin. Both of those cultures sweep more, right? And it's a more natural shot in those cultures for whatever reason. A lot of great Pakistani players sweep. We've had a couple of Indian players who sweep, but it seems to have disappeared a little bit. And I think if you look at the two cultures who are most sort of obsessed with using your feet, so getting down to the pitch of the ball, it's always been India and Australia, right? Those have been the two. Australian players are not taught to sweep all that much, and Indian players are so good on their feet that they don't need to sweep, right? The problem is that Megha, over the last, 15 years, spinners have just got quick.
Yeah.
And it is hard to use your feet and come down to spinners. It's very rare now for a spinner in a test match to put the ball above the batter's eye line. If you want to go back, the great Bisham Bedi, perhaps the best fourth innings bowler in the history of cricket, I don't think he would get picked these days because he would be too slow for international cricket. He probably bowled somewhere around 70, 75 kilometers an hour. And he would be so slow compared to that's 30 kilometers slower than what you're looking at for Akshar and Jadeja at their top end, right?
But would he be effective?
Well, I don't think he
as
could. I
per your
don't think he could
assessment?
anymore. And that's not saying that's not diminishing his greatness, because you could throw Warren in there as well. Warren bowled 78 kilometers an hour, and Matt Parkinson was told he was too slow, and his speeds were almost identical to Warren's. So the game has changed quite a bit in how you play spin and how you bowl spin. And the last two batters who really came down the wicket a lot in Test cricket were Pujara and Michael Clarke. Now, Pujara's basically retired, whether he knows he's retired or not. He's basically retired. And Clarke hasn't played in what, a decade?
Yeah.
Maybe 9 years. I don't know, whenever it was,
9 years.
2015.
The World Cup, yeah.
Yeah. And so you have those are the two players. If you look up, so CricViz and Opta and all those places have stats of how often batters come down the wicket, right? Those are the two guys who are miles ahead of anyone else, Megha. Miles ahead of anyone else. And they are from a different era already, right? And that is what the ultimate thing is can you be a rounder player of spin? So England, too obsessed with the sweep, right? Their players aren't good enough at using their feet when they have to. And when they do use their feet, they usually use them very poorly, right? Australia, too obsessed with using their feet in an era when it's really hard to use your feet because so many, especially finger spinners, are fast, but even the wrist spinners are getting really fast, right? Rashid Khan and Ravi Bishnoi, they're like right up there with some of the fastest, wrist spinners we've seen. And that comes off the back of Anil Kumble and Shahid Afridi, who, if they bowled in this era, would be really fast as well. But they were probably holding back a little bit in that era. So I think attacking the stumps and bowling quicker and keeping you in your crease is really, really important now. And so you need that all-round version of spin play. I think what India is doing with having more sporting seaman wickets at home, right? That year when Unadkat took like 12,000 Ranji wickets, right? Is fine because it's exactly what New Zealand did, right? So what did New Zealand do? They just went, okay, in first-class cricket, we don't need wickets that have green tops anymore. All of our players know how to play on green tops because they've grown up on green tops all the way through. What we need is flat test wickets, because flat test wickets is what New Zealanders need to get used to when they play test cricket. That's where they have their trouble. So India did the right thing there. The thing that was probably missed, and it's only and again, I'm very lucky to have that conversation with Rahul Dravid about this recently, but I also talked to someone else, a batting coach in India, about this not that long ago as well. And I asked both of them, the direct question: can you use your feet to spin as much? And they both like no. And they both came from a school where they told players, use your feet more, use your feet more. And it was the players who were saying to them, how do we use our feet? This guy's bowling 95 kilometers an hour, pitching on middle stump and straightening it. What are we supposed to do? Like, did I say 95 miles? I probably meant 95 kilometers, although it might have felt like 95 miles. And so it's a very different game, I think, now than it has been before. I don't think, though, this series suddenly means that India isn't the best players of spin. But I think it's one of those things you might look at and go, as a cricket community, are we teaching our players all the best options going forward, right? So I don't know if you remember Jason Roy. Jason Roy was terrible against spin and almost lost his career against spin. And England taught him one thing, to play a reverse sweep. And with that reverse sweep, it just made him slightly more difficult to bowl to, especially if you're spinning the ball away from him, because you were spinning it into the gap, essentially, that he was trying to reverse sweep it into. He didn't suddenly become a great player of spin, but he became a more rounded player of spin. And I remember working with Scotland, working with Kyle Kutzer in the UAE. And there was one time where Kyle Kutzer he was trying to use his feet and he couldn't get to these spinners. And he just went, oh, okay, I'll play reverse sweep. He played that, the whole ground opened up for him. Right? It's not, we don't want these Indian players to suddenly become Ben Duckett or Ollie Pope or that sort of level of player, right? That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about options. And if you go back to Sachin Tendulkar, who's probably not India's greatest player of spin, that would probably be Gavaskar or Dravid. But Sachin was also a great player of spin. He had multiple options available to him at all times. And so he could sweep when he needed to sweep, and he could use his feet, and he could cut. And it's that combination that makes it a much harder for the bowler to line them up. And I think that's probably, and this isn't a slight on any of the Indian players, this is probably just where that next generation needs to go to. In the same way that, traditionally Australian players just played the hook and the pull almost all the time, right? And then they got to a point where they were like, well, actually, if some of our players can actually duck the ball or turn the ball off their chest for one, that's also a really important thing. And then the other team can't just put two fielders out on the thing. You can be great and one-dimensional. And then if you're slightly below great and you're one-dimensional, that's when things start to happen. And perhaps we're seeing that. Having said all of that, it could just be one of those things and you don't need to worry about it at all.
And it isn't really 1980s where a reverse sweep can or would be seen as a bolt on your career. You know what I really mean there. But my batting and that reverse sweep. But yeah, as far as Indian domestic cricket is concerned, at least in the Ranji Trophy, Syed Mushtaq Ali Trophy, Vijay Hazare Trophy, the List A and T20 tournaments, there the matches are held on say 3 4 venues. But in Ranji Trophy it is played through the length and breadth of the country, so the wickets that are traditionally good for spin, at least those could be continued with, at least those could
Yeah.
stay true to their nature, so that players develop holistically and become more well rounded. And there are a lot of questions about, again, this series per se. And I think Manan Garg is the one who's making this point about it to do more with India having to chase in all three ODIs
Yeah.
and wickets getting worse as the match went on. This is something that we also saw in the T20Is, where Sri Lanka struggled when they were asked to chase or when they were chasing for whatever reasons.
Yeah, I had some friends. I think Sri Lanka were like 4-1 or something, or 3-1 when they were bowling in the last game, and a lot of my friends just absolutely loaded up on Sri Lanka based on what Manan is saying. They were like, all these wickets are getting tougher to play on. But if that would be more of an excuse if the team was Australia or New Zealand,
Yeah.
right? And you're like, you have to play
Okay.
on the worst of the conditions, and you're not particularly good against spin. Well, then the game's over, right? You know what I mean? Again, that's not quite the case with India. And if the pitches get harder, you have to handle them. That is part of what you do. This is the thing I would take away from all this, though. I think it's India came in with a slightly experimental way of looking at this. They had Riyan Parag and Washington Sundar as frontline bowlers when they have hundreds of better spinners than those two bowlers available to them, right? I think Washington's a really good player, but he's an all-round player. And Rian Parag, as we've talked about before, I don't think he's a bowler at all. In these sorts of situations, Sky was a bowler, but in general,
Yeah.
I don't think
Hmm.
he's necessarily a bowler.
Cannot be groomed into an all-rounder. Do you see the
Oh, I mean,
potential?
who knows? I mean, if he works in Asian conditions like this, then that's a huge bonus. I find it hard to believe he's ever going to be an all-rounder and be able to bowl 10 overs in an ODI in England, right? Unless that wicket is, is spinning sideways. So that's what an all-rounder is. An all-rounder should be able to play everywhere.
Hmm.
But he might be a good bowler in certain conditions. But regardless, and Washington can continue to grow as well. So what I thought when I looked at some of this, to go back to Daniel's point, was you were watching, it reminded me of England. So when England have played well over the last couple of years in spinning conditions, so when they bowled well in spinning conditions, Livingston has bowled well, right?
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
when
That's what
Livingston
came to my
bowls
mind.
well, that's the biggest problem I have for England is I think they're
Okay.
automatically going to lose that game when Livingston bowls well. And the reason being is the
Hmm.
chances are that the other team is going to have a better spinner than
Superior.
Livingston is their second best spinner, right? And that was a little bit what I was thinking about at this series at times when I was looking at this, overall. Um, that there is absolutely no doubt, as an overall package of, there was India were trying some things, and so they weren't even, they could have played better spinners, right? They could have played their absolutely their
Hmm.
best spin attack if they wanted to, but they weren't. They were trying younger players, they were trying different players, they were trying all rounders, they were trying part timers, they were trying Sky, right? Like it's a very different kind of situation. So I'm not too worried about that because that's what India should be doing in bilateral series. I would say over the last couple of years, there's been this theory that like there's been this pressure for India to consistently win bilateral series where it's like if I was an Indian fan right now, I would be happy with this
Hmm.
loss. They have learnt a whole bunch of things. Maybe they might even change the way, even in some of their strengths, they might change some things. And they've given players opportunities that they wouldn't always get. They went in with a really long batting lineup in one game to see how that went. All these different cool things that they tried. That's what you want them to do. And just on
Hmm. Yeah.
Mika's question here. So Jamie Alter's a friend of mine, a very learned person. Indians are the best against spin. You can look at all the. I've crunched every number ever. There is absolutely no doubt that Indians are the best players against spin. Sri Lankans are very, very close. And,
Hmm.
if you look at Aravinda de Silva, Mahela Jayawardene, Nakuma Sangakkara as the three best players, they stack up very, very high. But I don't think any of them are better than Sunil Gavaskar or Rahul Dravid, for instance, right? And
Hmm.
Pujara is very, very high in that list as well. And you go through the numbers of what those teams do. Like if, Warren and Murali both struggled against India, right? They
Hmm.
are unquestionably the two greatest spinners of all time. Now, some of that is conditions as well. It is, as I said before, they were slower spinners. Brian Lara, oh my God, I'm doing some name dropping today, but Brian Lara was saying to me recently that he was brilliant against spin when it was tossed up because that's how he learned to play spin. And when he got to India and Harbhajan and Kumble bowled a little bit flatter, he was like, oh, this is a new thing I need to work out how to play. Indians have the ability to play the faster, flatter spin and the tossed up spin in a way that even Sri Lankans haven't always been as good at. Whether Indians are the best players to spin right now is a more valid question. And I don't know if Mika or Jamie Alter are talking about that. But I think that's a more valid question just because of everything we've seen. But I find it hard to believe that Sri Lanka are better players to spin when literally their batters have been almost non-existent for 3 or 4 years, right? They've had a terrible batting lineup to think that they are the better team against spin. And there isn't who's the other side who's better against spin. The only other one I would even put in there is probably South Africa, which is the weirdest sentence I've ever said. And then you've got the sort of Bubba and Rizwan knocking spin around.
Hmm.
And then it depends on how you like your limited overspin.
Hmm. So is it that on rank turners against, say, spinners who are not regular spinners or, say, not world class, India struggles more? Remember Michael Clark, 2004 series? He returned with a fifer, and this was this test series that Australia won after a long time, but that game, obviously, they lost. And then this series that we are talking about, the spinners that India struggled against, it wasn't like India struggled against Hasaranga. They struggled against relatively inexperienced spinners. Well, Alage again does not have a lot of experience,
Mm.
or Vandersay for that matter. So Is it that unpredictability plays a role?
I don't think so. I mean, Van der Say's 400 years old, Mega, and Van der Say's old enough to be your grandfather. So I don't know. You could say he doesn't have experience. Um, I have no idea how old you are, but I know he's old. Um,
Let me do the calculations.
yeah, you work it out. See if I'm right. Certainly a very maybe a young uncle to you. No, I don't think it's about. I mean, I don't think the Michael Clark one was just a bit like the Joe Root one. Those guys
Hmm.
bowl quick spin and on
Hmm.
wickets that were falling apart, right? And they took wickets. I'm
Hmm.
not too worried about that. Welalaga is a brilliant bowler, right? He's young, and we've seen
Yeah.
him struggle at times because of his inexperience. But you put him on a pitch that's doing what he wanted to do. He should be playing for Sri Lanka for the next 12 years. And that's not including his batting as well, and he can bat. He's a fantastic player. And Van der Say is a very good backup spinner. I don't
Yeah.
think there's anything about Van der Say that is worse than a cricketer like Ish Sodhi. But the difference is that New Zealand don't have anyone else. Van der Say's come up against Hasaranga plus a bunch of great finger spinners, right?
Hmm. So not
And
as
so,
much international
yeah,
pedigree or experience. Yeah.
yeah, I think I mean, even then, I think he started in 2015. Am I
Yeah.
right in
Yeah.
saying? So he's been around, but you're right. No, he hasn't played as much, but he's experienced. He knows what he's like at his age. If he doesn't know what he's doing, I'd be
Just
very, very
34.
shocked.
Just 34.
Just 34. He feels 48. Um, so so I'm not worried about all that sort of stuff. I think it's interesting that I mean, if you put the spinners, if so India had Bishnoi,
Yeah.
um,
Exactly.
and then
Akshar.
Akshar, um, Sundar, and Rian Parag. Are they the four spinners that they kind of had
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
that? And then we had Hasaranga, Van der Say, Wellalage,
Velage.
and who's my
And the
and
batters who.
Asalanka. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. I think that's probably, all things considered, a slightly stronger four. And then as was it Daniel saying before? I can't remember who it was. No, Manan said before, I think in the comments. Um,
Hmm.
the innings that you bowl is really, really important too. And in these
Yeah.
particular
Yeah.
games,
Manan.
I
Yeah.
think
Made
that
that
mattered.
point.
So perhaps if you switched it around, you
Hmm.
might say, look, Sri Lanka might be slightly stronger, but now the conditions are in their favour for India, so they're going to do a little bit better. But you probably I mean, at this stage in their career, you would say that Asalanka is a much better spinner, compared to uh,
Riyan
Rian
Parag?
Parag, right? I think he's Asalanka is a very, very good bowler from that point of view. So Medusa says, Jamie Oldham was saying currently India is not best against spinners, not old days. But who's the best team against spinners then? Right?
But
Like
Jared,
Sri Lanka haven't made any runs for years. Um,
hmm.
it- you've got a team like South Africa, as I said before, who are average at the top order against spin and very good against it in the middle order, with two or three guys. So are they better than India against spin, than Rohit Sharma, than Shreyas Iyer? I find it hard to believe that those, Shubman Gill and those guys aren't better against spin
Hmm.
overall, and Jaiswal aren't better than South Africa. So you would have to, you can't just say they're not the best team against spin. You need to tell me who the best team against spin is that has replaced India. And as I said, all due respect to Jamie, who's the best team against spin at the moment? Sri Lanka hasn't made any runs anywhere for the last 4
Yeah.
years. And Pakistan players, the Pakistan team against spin is okay, but I wouldn't put
Hmm.
them as elite players of spin. Bangladesh again got trapped against spin a couple of times in the World Cup. So if I'm putting my money on anyone, I'm still definitely putting my money on India.
Probably the expectations are higher in case of India because conventional
Always,
wisdom
at all
suggests that
times.
they should be better. They should be better
Yeah.
against spin over any other team. But if we go decade by decade, and because you have so many numbers at your disposal at any given point of time, say starting from the 80s or for that matter 70s, three or four Indian players that you think were very convincing against spinners. Gavaskar could foot in the late 70s and early 80s. So let's
Yeah,
quickly
if you
do
go
this rapid
through,
fire.
you can go back before the 80s because
Fair enough.
but if you go through, most of the best players of spin up until the 50s were probably Indians and Australians.
Mm.
After the 50s, when Australian pitches changed quite a bit, Australian players just don't play spin as much. That's why there's no real spinners between Richie Benaud and Shane Warne. The pitches just didn't help, right? So the Australians sort of drop off at that point. And India completely takes over. You know, the two VJs, for instance, are
Yeah.
both absolutely brilliant players of spin. I know, you know, one of them didn't, well, both of them didn't play as many test matches as they should have.
Mm.
And there's a whole range of players who don't have great overall test records. So I would put Navjot Sidhu as one of the greatest
Mm.
players of spin I have ever seen, like way above most other players. But outside of 100 against the West Indies, which I think was on a wicket that did spin a bit, to be fair, uh, I don't think that his game didn't really translate. So what you have seen really from Gavaskar onwards is more rounded Indian batters, right? So
Okay.
you don't see the guys who are just great against spin and can't do anything
Mm.
else. So who would that be? Maybe Raina and Raidu would be maybe two of
Mm.
the more recent players that we've seen who've come through like that. But most Indian players now, you know, can handle. They might not always handle the short ball or pace bowling, or they might have a weakness outside off stump, but they can handle fast bowling. So they're a lot more rounded. Whereas the Indian batters of before were not as rounded. And so
Mm.
when you see players coming through now, and part of that is selection bias, right, Mega? Like if you're an Indian selector now, you probably assume most Indian players can handle spin.
Yeah.
Maybe not great against it, but can handle spin. What you're really
Mm.
looking for is the guy who could smack pace, right?
Handle
And
short ball. That's an obsession.
handle the short ball is a really important thing. And, you know, since 2019, the short ball has become so much more important in white ball cricket than
Yeah.
it ever was before. Having one thing that the two new balls actually, and weirdly you wouldn't think about it, but having the two balls rather than one ball does allow you to bowl more short balls without worrying about ruining the ball completely. So you can bowl more short balls and you're going to get more bounce and everything else. So I think since 2019, that World Cup was phenomenal for how many bounces we saw. The last 5 years, we've seen a lot more. So you have to be able to handle that. But you also just have to be able to handle pace bowling in general, right? Like not nicking off, staying in line, being able to score against pace bowling. And so there's probably a selection bias in Indian international players where you're looking for that. So I remember when Mumbai fans were obsessed with Shreyas Iyer not getting in the side,
Yeah.
right? And a big part of that was, I think India was saying, partly because of COVID, he hasn't developed against pace bowling enough yet, and we know that he might be one of the best players of spin, but we want a player who's slightly more well-rounded. And now they probably think to themselves, "Wow, Shreyas Iyer in his best form is still a great prospect, and if we can develop the other parts of his game, and he's just average against pace, he'll still be so much better against spin." So those are the sorts of things that Indian selectors have to think about now, and it's the same with Australia. I've talked to Australian selectors over the last 5 or 10 years, and they before weren't really. They would think about a player like Darren Lehman as, we'll bring him in because he's a spin specialist. Whereas now what they're doing is they're going, okay, how do we make Travis Head better against spin?
Yeah.
Because we want to
Yeah.
use him home and away because he's more destructive, right? We don't want to have Michael Bevan and Darren Lehman just come in for tests against spin. And there's two ways of going forward in the future, right? There is going all in on specialists. And so when you go to England, you have Ajinkya Rahane and you have, whoever else you think can handle the moving ball, right? And then when you play in Asia, you play Shreyas Iyer and spin specialists and Badu Radu, whoever else you want. But what teams are trying to do now is try and find more of that all-round player so they have them in their system all the time. And that probably should mean that India will have slipped back. I forget all the stuff I said at the start, which is probably also partially to blame. But India should be having a selection bias, looking for players who are as good against pace and spin. So at an international level, I think it's 50% pace, 50% spin around the world. Right now, that's not going to be the case in India and England and South Africa. That's not going to be the case in India. But if you look at the entire system, it's about 50-50, I think, of what you face in Test cricket overall. So you want a player who's going to be pretty good against both of those things at all times, right? And that doesn't mean they have to be great against them. So you might even see Indian players who are not great against pace bowling and not great against spin, but they're pretty good against both, get opportunities where another player is great against pace bowling but crap against spin, or vice versa.
There's this full-fledged debate going on in the comment section. That's why I am apprehensive as to which comment to pick and which to not, because I'd be doing disservice to the debate as a whole. There was one on Sanju Samson, whether he's good enough or not, and then again, subsequent comments against or for him. Sanju Samson, like Rishabh Pant, polarizes opinions because you find people at extreme ends. Some people believe that Rishabh Pant shouldn't be given the sort of run that he has been given. Maybe closing thoughts on both, because they do feature in India's plan of things across formats in case of Rishabh Pant and Sanju Samson, certainly in the limited overs format.
Very different players. Look, Rishabh Pant is on a trajectory of greatness, right? Like I saw there's been a bunch of comments in there about the fact that he's, I don't know, it's no longer cute when he plays attacking shots.
Yeah.
Opposition teams are terrified of Rishabh Pant. Absolutely terrified of Rishabh Pant. What he can do in Test cricket and T20 cricket, it hasn't. What's his record in ODI cricket? Is it ODIs where he's been struggling
It's
so far?
better than T20Is.
Is it better?
T20Is is where he struggles.
It's T20. Yeah, sorry, I got those confused. I in no way would be worried about a 26-year-old who averages 43 in Test cricket with a strike rate of 76 in T20s. So what is he? 2,327. So those are not great numbers at the moment, but his domestic numbers are 3,245. He will fix that, so that isn't an issue. One-day cricket, he's averaging 33 at more than a run ball. Completely the job that you want Rishabh Pant to do. In fact, if anything, I would be encouraging him to try and score even quicker. So yeah, I would have no issue with that at all. You back a player like that because he's not even at his peak yet. Most batters peak between 28 and 32, right?
Yeah.
And he gives you a second skill. I've got no issue with him at all. Sanju Samson is really interesting because Sanju Samson has become that sort of player that all the international teams really like having in their squad, right? That sort of Matthew Wade type player. I'm trying to think. England have had a few. England had tried Joe Denley in that role. I don't think South Africa have done it. Daryl Mitchell does it for New Zealand, which is, and Daryl Mitchell ended up being too good for New Zealand. But what they really want is a squad member who can bat anywhere from 1 to 6, right? Because the World Cup squads are too small.
Yeah.
So you want to keep a player like Sanju Samson around because you have the ability, to actually pick him, and in any particular position here, right? And he can open, he can bat first drop, second drop. He can come in at 5 or 6 because of his play against spin if he had to. That's the player that a lot of these teams are trying to develop, and it's probably a big difference between the better sides and the other sides out there, is that ability to be like, well, Matthew Wade might not be better than other batters outside of this squad, but we can open with Matthew Wade, and he can bat at number 3, and he can bat at number 5 and number 6, right? So he gives them incredible flexibility. Plus, Sanju Samson and Matthew Wade both have a second skill, which Joe Denley did, which even Daryl Mitchell has a little bit of, right? So you're picking a player who you know is not quite at the same level because of the incredible flexibility they give you in a World Cup squad that is too small, right? Just to answer a couple of other questions here. Dex says, Sri Lanka batting is weak. Yeah, I've said that like 5 times on this episode. Do people actually listen? And Sag says, oh, come on, no one was terrified in the IPL.
Rishabh
People
Pant
have been,
was the context.
of Rishabh Pant, right? I think they're talking about that.
Yeah.
Let me tell you what international bowlers tell me. He is a menace. They are terrified of what he can do. They are terrified of the fact he can string sixes together, but also that he's a top level batter. So there's a difference between someone who can string a bunch of sixes together, who's a hitter, right? Eventually, if you talk to a bowler, they'll be like, yeah, look, this guy's really tough, but we can get to him. With Rishabh Pant, because he can average over 40 in Test cricket, there's a lot of teams are really worried about that. People weren't worried about him in the last IPL because he was coming back from a major injury, Sag. You've got to, the problem with Indian fans at the moment is everyone. I saw someone before say Shreyas Iyer was trash. Sanju
Yeah.
Samson was trash. Now we've got no one being afraid of Rishabh Pant. Do you know when you talk to international players, anyone else would take any of those three players in their side at the moment. Australia would love to have Sanju Samson. He's a better version of Matthew Wade, who I just said a minute ago, right? Shreyas Iyer would walk into most international teams because he would be their best player of spin, and they would back the fact that they have enough good players of pace around to be able to do that. And Rishabh Pant, I mean, come on now. What are we even talking about? And this is the issue here. It's good for India that they lost this series. They will learn more about what they need to do, and they lost it because they were experimenting. This is a really good thing for them, and it's a really good. This is a weird bilateral series where it was a good story for both, right? Sri Lanka just needed some confidence, right? They just needed to beat. So I've been commenting on Sri Lanka for what, 3 or 4 years, that they almost never beat teams that are as good as them or better than them. So if you look at Sri Lanka, they dominate everyone who's worse than them. They almost never lose those games. Really, really good. And the minute they play a good team, they don't. Well, now we've seen them play a good team and hold their
Yeah.
nerve in key moments over and over again against, even on paper, still a better side than them. And they had injuries as well, Sri Lanka, right? So when you look at all that, it's a good story for Sri Lanka, but it's a good story for India because India have learnt a bunch of things. They have things to go and work on, and they still know that they're one of the best sides in the world. That is what bilateral series should be from here. So I would see this as a win for both teams. And I've, and so a lot of people who are going to be very, very negative and everything else, it does not matter if the Indian cricket team or the Sri Lankan cricket team win this series, right? What it matters is both of these sides learn some things because there are 2 ICC tournaments coming up in turning conditions in the not too distant future, right? They need to learn as much as they can. And the best teams for India to learn against is going to be a team like Sri Lanka who does actually play these conditions really, really well. I saw Dex again going, Sri Lanka won't win in Australia. I mean, we know. Why do you need to tell us things we already know? But they're not playing there. They're playing here, right? And so that's a really, really important thing to know, right? And so this is a really key series from that point of view. And I'm just going to finish off with one last thing. Sag says, Rishabh Pant is good, Jarrod, but terrified is a bit much. I'm sorry. I have to apologize for all the
Test
bowlers.
series,
Yeah,
England,
yeah.
England
I'll have
series. Remember,
exactly.
it impacted how they declared. Rishabh Pant being there impacted how and when they declared.
Yeah, I'd like to apologise for all the bowlers, Sag, who don't share your view. Maybe if you had ever bowled to Rishabh Pant, you would understand why they are so worried about him. But I'm not going to get too much into that sort of stuff. But this is the point. Oh no, they're not terrified. They just really fear him because he's a very good player. A minute ago, there are people saying that he's been indulged too much. Do you see what I'm saying? There's that look for perfection. I think this was a really interesting series because I think both teams came out of it very, 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 very well. Even if the better team lost, that's okay. Some of these things can happen.
And the discourse after Sri Lanka's T20I loss was like they are tarnishing the legacy that has been created for Sri Lanka. They were like this blot on all of it. And that has kind of drastically changed now about now it being about India losing a bilateral
Exactly.
series and that being a massive deal. For the longest time, we kept ranting that India win all the bilaterals and don't win the big ICC trophies. Because we have won the T20 World Cup, I guess we get to lose the bilaterals if I
You can
have
lose as
already
many
said it.
bilaterals as you want. I would, if I was Australia, England, and India, I wouldn't be trying to lose them, but I would be trying to learn something new every single bilateral, right? That is the thing that you would need to do.
Thanks, guys, for riling up Jarrod, something that I couldn't do. All right,
You
then.
know, you
We'll
started
join
it.
again.
You always start it, Megha.
Did I? No, not me. Certainly not me. Thanks, guys. I wouldn't take your credit. All right, then. Bye bye.